I had heard tales of the doll forest for as long as I could remember. In the whispered stories from the village elders, the forest was a place no one in their right mind would visit, especially not at night. They said a man had once lived there decades ago in a crude shack and hung dolls from the trees, believing they would keep the spirit of a dead girl away. That evening, as the sun began to sink below the horizon, the urge to go there became unbearable. It wasn't mere curiosity, but a strange, unsettling feeling that had been growing inside me for days, as though the forest itself was calling to me. I followed a dirt path lined with wild grass and weeds until it turned into a barely visible trail with thick branches intertwining above my head. The air seemed to change with every step, growing thick and cold, even though it was the middle of summer. My footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest swallowed the sound before it could reach my ears. Finally, I arrived at a part of the forest where the trees were tall, ancient, and coated in moss. Here and there, tangled in the branches, hung worn dolls. Some were barely intact, their bodies faded and moldy, with glass eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. I noticed that some of the dolls had no eyes, their empty sockets staring straight at me, as if they were watching. Others were covered in brown stains, torn and almost unrecognizable from time and decay. A cold wind slipped through the trees, lifting a whisper of dry leaves, and with it came a feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. But when I looked around, I only saw dolls, each fixed in its place, with those vacant, lifeless gazes. I forced myself to walk beyond the first trees adorned with those decayed figures. As I moved forward, the atmosphere grew even heavier, and a metallic smell began to fill the air. It smelled of rust, damp earth, and something else. Something that made my stomach turn, a mix of fear and revulsion I couldn't quite place. A faint rustling behind me made me turn sharply. I saw a doll on the ground, its neck broken, its face torn. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. I tried to tell myself it must have fallen in the wind, but my hands began to shake. When I took a step forward, the breeze blew again, and suddenly, a soft sound reached my ears. It was a murmur, low and barely audible, like a tiny, distant voice. I stopped, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from all around, surrounding me. I looked up and noticed that the eyes of some dolls appeared to follow my movements, as if their heads had turned slightly. I blinked, convinced it was an illusion, but when I looked again, their eyes were still fixed on me, accusatory. I kept walking, trying to ignore the dolls, but the whispering grew louder. They weren't words, or at least not words I could understand, but the tone was menacing, filled with pain and resentment. My breathing grew shallow, and goosebumps rose on my arms. I wasn't alone in that forest, I could feel it. And even though I couldn't see it, something dark was lurking in the shadows. Some branches snapped in the distance, and then I saw a fleeting figure among the trees, like a flash of light. I froze, waiting for it to appear again, but all I saw was a doll swaying on a nearby branch, its vacant face slowly turning toward me. I decided to move closer, and when I reached out to touch it, a chill ran through my entire body, as if something invisible had passed through me. My fingers brushed the doll's worn fabric, and suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my head, like a foreign memory trying to force its way into my mind. It was a quick vision, a young girl crying, clutching a doll identical to the one in front of me. I saw a large, rough hand wrenching the doll from her grasp, and heard a scream that ended abruptly. I stepped back, breathing heavily. The vision faded, but the sense of being ensnared by something deeper than mere legends lingered. There was something in the air, something palpable and heavy. The dolls seemed to have a purpose, a connection to death, pain, and oblivion. Something told me this forest held a secret, one that perhaps shouldn't be revealed. Then, as I tried to turn back, I heard a different sound. It was like shuffling footsteps, a broken whisper that wasn't just the wind. I looked around, but saw nothing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then, the sound grew closer, and a faint, eerie laugh made me freeze. It was the laugh of a little girl. I stood in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I wasn't alone. And despite the fear, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest, toward the mysteries it held, toward that presence that seemed to stalk me from the shadows. Back in my home, the memory of the forest lingered, a shadow creeping at the edge of my thoughts. I couldn't get the image of those decaying dolls out of my mind, or the faint, haunting laugh that had seemed to follow me out of the trees. I felt compelled to know more, to understand why someone would choose to spend their life hanging dolls in that forsaken place. So, I started digging into the past, hoping to find some explanation that would make the forest less sinister, or at least less real. After a few days of sifting through local records, old news clippings, and asking around the village, a disturbing picture began to form. The man who hung the dolls had been a recluse named Tomas Morales. He had moved to the area sometime in the 1940s, though no one knew exactly from where. From what I gathered, Tomas was a quiet man, largely keeping to himself, but every so often, someone from town would see him wandering around the outskirts, carrying bundles of dolls in his arms, eyes sunken and distant. The most disturbing part, however, was that Tomas hadn't simply decided to hang dolls in the forest out of some eccentric compulsion. No, he believed, wholeheartedly, that the dolls were a barrier, a shield against the restless spirit of a young girl who had died in tragic circumstances near the forest. Her name, I learned, was Anna. She had been only 10 when she drowned in the river that ran alongside the forest, her body found tangled in weeds just past the edge of the trees. The story would have been heartbreaking enough if it had ended there, but there was more. Rumors swirled that Anna's spirit had never left that forest, that Tomas had been haunted by her ghost, and that the dolls were his way of keeping her wrathful spirit at bay. As I read more, I couldn't shake the image of the girl's pale face and lifeless eyes watching Tomas, judging him, and I wondered if she was somehow watching me now, following my every move. The next night, as I lay in bed, a strange chill settled over the room. The air felt thick, almost damp, and the temperature seemed to drop by degrees, as if I had left a window open. I sat up and checked the window, but it was closed tightly. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I could barely make out any words, but the voice was unmistakably that of a young girl. My skin prickled as I strained to hear. The whisper grew louder, but still, the words remained maddeningly out of reach, a mix of syllables just beyond my comprehension. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone in the corner of the room, but the shadows were empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and finally, I snapped on the light. The whisper vanished instantly, and the temperature returned to normal. I was alone, at least, as alone as I could feel after such an unsettling experience. The strange occurrences continued over the next few days. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of a small figure in the mirrors at home, or feel a presence behind me, close enough that the hair on my neck would stand up. Each time, I'd turn to see only empty space. I told myself it was stress, that I was getting too absorbed in the stories and the folklore, letting my imagination get the best of me. But each night, the whispers returned, their tone increasingly urgent, almost angry. It was as if Anna herself were reaching out from beyond, warning me, or perhaps trying to draw me back to her forest. Unable to resist, I returned to the forest, armed with more questions than answers. As I stepped into the clearing where I had seen the first of Tomas's dolls, I immediately noticed something was different. The arrangement of the dolls had changed. Where once they had hung randomly, now they seemed to be positioned with purpose, each one turned toward the path, watching me as I entered. Their heads, some cracked and broken, seemed twisted just enough to give each a clear view of my arrival. I moved forward cautiously, the thick silence weighing down on me, and it wasn't long before I noticed more changes. Some of the dolls were now facing each other, and it looked as though their tiny hands were clasped together in grotesque mockery of a child's playtime. Others hung lower than before, almost close enough to touch. I brushed against one by accident, and the doll's glassy eyes seemed to widen as it turned, watching me from over my shoulder. In the distance, I caught sight of something half hidden among the trees. I made my way over, the undergrowth crunching beneath my feet, and found myself standing in front of what appeared to be a shrine. Dolls were arranged in a rough circle around a small, crumbling stone structure, no taller than my knee. A doll with empty eye sockets sat at the center, its plastic hands clutching a yellow piece of paper. My pulse quickened as I reached for it. The paper was brittle, its edges frayed and spotted with dark stains that looked disturbingly like dry blood. As I unfolded it, a few faded words were visible, but they were smeared and almost unreadable. The parts one could make out sent a chill down my spine. Keep away. Anna, and then, curse. The last words seemed to bleed off the paper, as though the ink had refused to hold their meaning. I was about to turn back when a gust of icy wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint, childlike laughter. It echoed around me, too close and too real to be imagined. I spun around, but no one was there, just the dolls, each one watching with unblinking, soulless eyes. The sound faded, but something else lingered in the air, an oppressive feeling, as though I had trespassed into something sacred, something dark. A sudden memory of Tomas Morales came to mind, a man surrounded by dolls, desperately trying to protect himself from something unseen. I felt an odd sense of kinship with him, as though I understood now the torment he must have faced. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tomas's obsession with hanging the dolls hadn't been enough. That there was something else, something hidden, that he'd been unable to protect himself from. Leaving the forest, I felt as if I was following me all the way to the edge of the trees. But as I emerged, the weight lifted, and the warmth of the sun returned. I hurried home, trying to shake the sensation, but the mystery of the dolls gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't stop now. The more I learned, the deeper I was pulled into Anna's tragic story. And the more I uncovered, the more I felt her ghostly presence trailing after me, as if urging me to uncover something Tomas had never found. The night was worse than ever. I barely managed to fall asleep before waking to the sound of shuffling footsteps outside my bedroom door. When I went to check, I found nothing, but when I turned back, I saw it, clear as day, a single doll, lying on the floor of my bedroom, its blank, glass eyes fixed on me. I couldn't recall bringing the doll in, let alone placing it on my floor. Dread settled over me as I picked it up, realizing its face was almost identical to the doll I'd seen at the shrine. I tried to discard it, leaving it in a closet, but the whispers followed me, louder than before, words now forming that seemed to pierce my mind, echoing with a message I was still too afraid to understand. I returned to the forest one last time, a desperate sense of urgency guiding my steps. Every attempt to walk away from this dark mystery had only strengthened its grip on me. The eerie phenomena in my home, the whispers, the glimpses of shadows, and the inexplicable appearances of dolls had grown unbearable, haunting me day and night. It was as if the spirit of Anna herself was demanding that I return, pulling me back towards something I was destined to confront. As I crossed into the forest, I immediately noticed a shift. The silence was thicker, almost as if the air was charged with electricity, and the trees felt denser, their branches stretching like bony fingers, knitting together above me to block out what little light there was. I moved forward, my flashlight illuminating the path in shaky, narrow beams. The further I went, the more distorted the forest seemed, like the world around me was slowly bending, warping, readying itself to reveal something I might not be able to understand. The deeper I ventured, the more dolls appeared, hanging from nearly every branch. They were in various stages of decay, some moldy and broken, others pristine as though they had just been placed. Their eyes, whether cracked glass or painted on buttons, seemed to follow me with greater intensity than before, almost as if they were alive, bearing witness to the confrontation that was about to unfold. Ahead, I noticed the faint glimmer of the stone shrine I had discovered on my previous visit. But this time, there was something new. A large, ancient-looking doll stood beside it, nearly as tall as a child. Its face was eerily realistic, its eyes wide and hollow, and it wore a tattered white dress stained with dirt and mold. As I stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming cold seep into my bones, as if the doll itself was exuding a dark energy. There, clutched in the doll's small hands, was an old, cracked photograph. I shined my light on it, and the sight made my heart stutter. It was a picture of a young girl with wide, sorrowful eyes, and standing beside her was a man. The face of the man was unmistakable. It was Tomas Morales, the man who had placed these dolls throughout the forest. But the girl's face struck me even harder. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, a feeling I couldn't shake. It was like staring into a reflection I hadn't known was there, an unsettling sense of recognition that made my stomach twist. A wave of realization washed over me, chilling me to my core. This girl wasn't a random spirit haunting the forest. She was connected to me, to my own family, in some way that I had never been told. I suddenly remembered an old story my grandmother had once told me about a girl who had drowned in the river nearby, a distant cousin who was said to haunt the family, her spirit never finding peace. Could Anna be related to me? As I stood there, reeling from this revelation, a soft, familiar voice filled the air, a child's whisper. "You're here," it said, and this time, I heard the words clearly. The voice seemed to echo from every direction, enveloping me, wrapping me in a chilling embrace. "You came back, just like he did." The voice was both sweet and menacing, and as I looked around, the forest seemed to transform. The trees stretched higher, the dolls swayed as if alive, and the path I had taken had disappeared entirely. I was trapped, surrounded by these ghostly, unblinking faces. Desperate to find answers, I began speaking out loud, calling to the spirit. "Anna, I'm here. What do you want from me? Why are you haunting this place?" The whispering stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the temperature plummeted, and a thick fog rolled in, curling around my legs. Out of the mist, the figure of a young girl slowly emerged, pale and ethereal. She looked like the girl in the photograph, her eyes wide, her dress torn and wet, as if she had just crawled out of the river. "I never left," she whispered, her voice carrying an undertone of bitterness. "He tried to trap me here, with his dolls, his offerings. But I'm still here, waiting. And now, you've come to take his place." A jolt of horror shot through me. "Take his place?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand." She stepped closer, her translucent face a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Tomas hung the dolls to keep me bound, but it was never enough. His fear kept him coming back, feeding my presence, keeping me here. And you're bound by blood. You came back, just like he did, and now you're mine. I staggered back, realization dawning on me. Tomas hadn't simply been warding off a ghost, he had been trying to contain something far worse, and his own actions had trapped him in a cycle he could never escape. Now, by stepping into the forest, by confronting her, I had taken his place in a twisted ritual, one that bound me to the forest just as he had been. No. I can't. This isn't possible. I yelled, backing away. But as I turned, I saw that the dolls had closed in, forming an almost solid wall around me. Their heads turned in unison, eyes glinting with a dark, malicious light, and I realized there was no way out. Anna's spirit hovered before me, her face a mask of innocent malice. "You will stay here," she said softly, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You'll keep me company, just like he did." And then, in one blinding moment, reality fractured. I was no longer standing in the forest. I was back at the edge of the river, watching as a man, Tomas, desperately hung doll after doll in the trees, his hands shaking, his face drawn with terror. I felt his fear, his despair, his realization that no amount of dolls could ever rid him of the spirit that now consumed him. I blinked, and I was back in the forest, my own hands clutching a doll. I tried to let go, but my fingers wouldn't obey. The spirit had taken hold of me, binding me to her will. I was trapped, just like Tomas, compelled to hang doll after doll, to keep her presence bound to the forest. Each doll I placed felt like an anchor, chaining me to the haunted earth, as if I, too, were becoming a part of the ritual. And then I understood the true horror. The dolls weren't there to ward off the spirit, they were there to bind me, to keep me in place, to make me a part of the forest itself. Tomas had been right, there was no escape. The last thing I remember is placing the final doll, a sickening feeling of resignation settling over me. I was part of the forest now, just another guardian bound to this cursed place, forced to keep the spirit of Anna contained. The whispers surrounded me, filling my mind, my very soul. Years would pass, and people would come and go, some daring to step into the forest, drawn by the same call that had brought Tomas and me here. And I would watch, my spirit tethered to the trees, my only companions the lifeless dolls, each one bearing witness to the eternal vigil I was now destined to keep. I had heard the rumors long before I even set eyes on the mansion. The old house by the St. Lawrence River had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. But it wasn't the state of decay or the missing roof tiles that intrigued me, it was the stories. Whispers about dark rituals, about the family that had lived there, their tragic fates, and the rumors that the mansion itself had become a tomb of sorts, hiding secrets too terrible to be spoken aloud. Of course, I didn't believe any of it. Superstitions, they called it, just an old house with a lot of rumors surrounding it. A little too dramatic for my tastes. But when I was offered a chance to explore the mansion for a personal project, I took it. Skepticism was my closest companion. Surely, an old house like this wouldn't hold anything but dust and forgotten memories. The moment I stepped onto the overgrown lawn, I felt something shift in the air. It was subtle, just the faintest prickling sensation along my skin, like the house itself was watching me. I shook off the feeling and made my way up the weathered steps. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and echoing in the stillness. The interior was as I expected. Old, decaying, forgotten. The wallpaper peeled in great strips, exposing the plaster beneath. There was an eerie silence that settled over everything. I could hear nothing but the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet as I moved deeper into the house. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with doors that had long since lost their handles. Some rooms were completely empty, their windows boarded up. Others were filled with the remnants of lives that had once been lived here, furniture covered in dust and mildew, books that had been left to rot on shelves. But it wasn't the abandonment that caught my attention. It was the details. Old symbols, barely visible beneath layers of grime, scratched into the walls, strange, arcane shapes that made my skin crawl. I had no idea what they meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were there for a reason. I paused at the top of a staircase leading to the second floor. The floor was unstable, its wooden beams creaking ominously as I tested my weight. My mind flashed to the stories I'd heard, the stories about the family that had lived here. The ones who had supposedly dabbled in things they shouldn't have. Who had, according to the rumors, paid a terrible price for their curiosity. But I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. I had come here to investigate, to debunk the myths. I wasn't going to let superstition cloud my judgment. So, I continued. Upstairs, the rooms were much darker, the air thick with a musty smell of old wood and decay. The wallpaper here was even more faded, the designs barely visible. As I stepped into the first room, something made me pause, a small object, half hidden beneath the bed. It was a pendant, an old-fashioned thing with a strange symbol engraved into it. The kind of symbol I had seen on the walls earlier. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was cold to the touch, the metal tarnished with age. There was no way the pendant had been there long, not with the way the dust had settled on the floor. I slipped it into my pocket, my unease growing. Something was off here, and the growing weight in the pit of my stomach told me that I hadn't even scratched the surface of whatever this place held. I moved through the rest of the upstairs rooms, taking note of their disarray. It was as though the occupants had left in a hurry. Clothes were thrown about, books scattered on the floor. In one room, I found a stack of photographs, the faces of a family, their smiles frozen in time. The man and woman were younger, and there were children, 2 girls. Their faces were all too familiar, though I couldn't place why. As I examined the photographs, I noticed something odd. There were no pictures of them after a certain point. The final photo in the stack was a dark, blurry image of the house itself. It was taken at night, and though the quality was poor, I could make out a shadow in one of the windows. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't explain why. The next few hours passed uneventfully. I combed through the rooms, documenting my findings, taking notes, and trying to reassure myself that the house was nothing more than a relic of a forgotten time. But it wasn't enough. Something lingered in the air, something I couldn't see but could feel, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. It was as I walked past the dining room that I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, a scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no logical explanation for it. No animal, no wind. Just the sound of something unnatural. I took a deep breath and stepped into the dining room, every sense alert. The room was just as abandoned as the rest, the long table covered in a thick layer of dust. But there, on the far side of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A door, slightly ajar, leading to what appeared to be a basement. The faintest sliver of light seeped from beneath the doorframe. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. Despite every instinct in my body telling me to turn back, I moved forward, drawn by an unknown force. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a rush of cold air hit me. The basement was a maze of shadows, filled with old crates and furniture. But it wasn't the things in the basement that caught my attention, it was the walls. covered in the same symbols I'd seen upstairs. But these were different. These were fresher, as if they had been carved recently. And then I heard it. A whisper, so soft it was barely a sound, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, except for the faint outline of something on the floor, a pattern, a symbol I recognized all too well. A family crest, the same as the one on the pendant I had found earlier. That was when I knew. This house, these walls, these whispers, they were not the product of superstition. They were the remnants of something real. Something dark. And I was only just beginning to understand what that darkness truly was. I didn't leave. Instead, I decided to stay the night, to see what else this house had to offer. To uncover the secrets hidden beneath its rotting wood and faded walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just beyond my reach. The night crept in slowly, casting long shadows across the decaying walls of the mansion. I could feel it now, the weight of the house pressing in on me, the way the air thickened with every passing hour. Every time I thought I was alone, something whispered just out of reach, like a presence that hovered behind me, waiting. I knew I couldn't turn back now. I had already gone too far. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, I was already entangled in its web, whether I wanted to be or not. I had to know the truth. The rumors, the strange symbols, the eerie feeling in the air, there had to be an explanation. But I was beginning to realize that the deeper I went, the less I wanted to find out. I decided to focus on the family that had lived here, the ones who had supposedly dabbled in dark rituals, whose secrets had been buried with them. The photographs I'd found earlier weren't enough. There had to be more, something that could explain what happened to them. The mansion groaned around me as I made my way back to the main hallway. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. But I pressed on. There were still rooms to explore, still things to discover. I found the first journal hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It was an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, as if whoever had written it had been trying to get something down before it was too late. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, as if the writer's mind had begun to unravel. The name Delacroix appeared again and again, Louis Delacroix, the patriarch of the family. The first few entries were mundane, mentions of family gatherings, the arrival of guests, a sense of normalcy that quickly gave way to something darker. There were references to the circle, cryptic mentions of rituals, and words that I didn't quite understand, like summoning and binding. The deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. One entry, dated just weeks before the family disappeared, caught my attention. The rituals are growing more intense. I can feel it, feel the power building. The entity we are trying to summon, it's real. And it is hungry. I fear we are too late. The pact has already been made, and there is no turning back. I turned the page, my breath catching in my throat. The next entry was far darker. They are watching. Not just the house, but us. I hear them whispering in the walls. At night, the children see things. I have begun to question everything, even my own mind. Are we truly in control? Or have we opened a door that cannot be closed? The entries trailed off after that, leaving me with more questions than answers. What had they done? What had they summoned? I set the journal aside and picked up the second, tucked inside an old wooden chest in the living room. This one was different. It was a woman's handwriting. The entries were more lucid, but just as disturbing. Her name was Madeline Delacroix, Lewis's wife. Her journal revealed even more about the family's descent into madness. She wrote of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, shadows that followed them from room to room, voices in the night. She spoke of the children, how they had changed after one of the rituals. They had stopped speaking, withdrawn into themselves, their eyes dull and lifeless. She wrote of a sickness that overtook her husband, of how his mind seemed to slip further away with each passing day. One entry stood out. "I don't know who we are anymore. We are not the people we once were. I saw the children last night. Their eyes were not their own. There is something in this house. It feeds on us. We are feeding it." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I read the words. It was as if Madeline knew exactly what was happening, and yet she felt powerless to stop it. I could feel the mansion growing darker around me, the silence pressing in with an almost physical weight. I had come here for answers, but now, as I stood in the midst of these stories, these shattered lives, I began to wish I had never set foot in the house. There was something malevolent here, something ancient and powerful that didn't want me to uncover the truth. I moved to the next room, feeling the walls close in around me. It was a library, the shelves still lined with books, though most had long since been destroyed by mold and time. In the center of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was gilded, but the glass had cracked, distorting their reflection in odd ways. As I stood before it, something caught my eye, an inscription etched into the glass. "We are bound together. We are one." The words sent a chill down my spine. I had seen that phrase somewhere before. The pendant. The symbol on the wall. The same words that had been written in the journals. They were tied together somehow, these objects, these people, and the house itself. I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, and the moment my fingers brushed against the cracked glass, a sharp, painful jolt shot up my arm. I gasped, pulling my hand back, but the pain lingered. And then, something else. A fleeting image, a glimpse of something not quite right. A face. Pale, gaunt, its eyes wide with terror. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even someone I recognized. But the face looked as though it had been trapped, as if it were trying to scream, trying to break free from the glass. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I had seen it. I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. And in that moment, I knew that the house was alive. Not in the way a house was alive, but in a way that defied reason, defied logic. The house was feeding on something that had been left behind when the family vanished. I looked around, desperate for some kind of explanation. But there was none. Only the whispering shadows, the unsettling sensation of being watched. The feeling that the house was no longer just a place, it was a presence, a living thing that had absorbed the family's secrets. It wanted to keep them buried. But I couldn't leave now. I had to know. As I turned to leave the room, the floor beneath me shifted. I stumbled, my hands shooting out to steady myself, but the ground gave way. A door opened where there had been none before. A staircase, hidden in the shadows, led down into the unknown. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at the staircase. It was calling to me. I took the first step. And then another. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But something was following me. I could feel it, the heavy weight of it pressing on my back, its eyes on me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to find the truth or if the truth had already found me. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step groaning as if the house itself was warning me to turn back. But I was past the point of no return. There was no turning back. Not now. The staircase descended into a narrow, dimly lit corridor, its air thick and oppressive. I could barely see where it led, the walls closing in on me with each step, as if the mansion was narrowing its grip, preparing to swallow me whole. The whispers had grown louder now, their words unintelligible but unmistakably urgent, urging me onward. I felt something, someone, pushing me forward, a presence that wasn't entirely my own. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself standing in a chamber, far more elaborate than any room I had seen before. It was large, with high vaulted ceilings, though the once gilded fixtures were now tarnished and covered in a thick layer of dust. At the center of the room was a stone altar, worn and cracked, its surface stained with something I couldn't bear to identify. Around the altar were symbols, those same markings I had seen on the walls of the house, on the pendant, in the journals. They formed a pattern, a circle of power that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then I saw them, the figures standing in the shadows, their outlines blurred by the flickering candlelight. There were 5 of them, cloaked in tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. But their presence was unmistakable. They had been waiting for me. "You've come," a voice echoed in the chamber, smooth, almost reassuring. It was a voice I knew, one I had heard in the journals, in the whispers. Louis Delacroix, the patriarch of the family. But his voice, it wasn't just his anymore. It was layered with something else, something ancient and twisted. The figure stepped forward, revealing itself, Louis, but not Louis. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, as though he had been pulled from the very depths of hell itself. "You've uncovered the truth, haven't you?" he said, his voice like gravel. "The house is not abandoned. Not really. It has been waiting for the final piece." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the air growing heavier with every passing second. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The words wouldn't come. It was as though the house itself had stolen them from me. "You see," Louis continued, his eyes glowing with a sickly light, "the family was never meant to escape. The rituals, the power they sought, it was never for them. They were pawns. Tools for something greater." He raised his hand, and the room seemed to shift, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly, pulsing with energy. I took a step back, my body trembling. I knew what was happening, what had been happening all along. The family hadn't summoned an entity. No. They had become the entity, had bound themselves to the house, to the very land. They had been trapped in a ritual of their own making, but it wasn't their will that had kept them here. It was mine. I was the final piece. I could feel it then, the truth that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. This was no ordinary haunting. This wasn't some innocent family caught in the web of the occult. The house wasn't merely haunted, it was a living, breathing thing, a conduit for dark forces that had been fed and nurtured over generations. The Delacroix family had been the caretakers, the ones who had kept the ritual going, kept the mansion's curse alive. But now, it needed me. "You have always been part of this," Louis said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "From the moment you walked into this house, the ritual began. The house knew you. It always has. The symbols, the whispers, they've been guiding you. You think you've been uncovering the truth, but all along, it has been pulling you closer. The final piece. The sacrifice." My mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in an overwhelming rush. The pendant. the journal, the mirror, the basement. It had all been leading here, to this moment, to this room. I was not just an observer. I had never been. I was a participant, a pawn in a ritual that had been set in motion long before I ever stepped foot in this mansion. One of the figures in the shadows moved forward, revealing itself, Madeleine Delacroix, the mother. Her face was as gaunt and hollow as Louis's, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and regret. She looked at me with pity. "We tried to stop it," she whispered, her voice raw, like a scream trapped in a cage. "We didn't know. We never knew. But now, you do. And you have to choose." I felt a pull, something deep within me urging me toward the altar. A part of me wanted to run, to escape, to flee from this nightmare. But another part, a darker part, was calling me forward, whispering that this was where I truly belonged. The ritual had been set in motion long ago, but it needed my participation to reach completion. And the final step, it was a choice I had to make. I turned back to the altar, my eyes drawn to the stone slab at its center. There, etched into the surface, was a symbol I hadn't seen before, a twisted representation of the house itself, its foundations and walls intertwined like a living organism. I understood then. The mansion, the curse, it wasn't just about the family. It was about the land, about the river, about the very essence of the house and the power it had been feeding off for centuries. "If you choose to end this," Louis said, his eyes narrowing, "the house will die with you. The curse will be broken, and all of us will be freed. But if you choose to stay, to become part of it, then the cycle will continue. You will become one of us." The choice was unbearable. One path would release me from this nightmare, end the mansion's curse, and free the trapped spirits of the Delacroix family. The other would bind me to this place forever, turning me into a part of the house's eternal, malevolent force. I closed my eyes, the decision tearing at my soul. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind, urging me to choose, to become one with the darkness. But as my hand hovered above the altar, ready to make my final decision, I heard something that froze me in place. A voice, not from Louis, not from Madeleine, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, a voice I hadn't heard before. "None of this matters." I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. And in the shadows, something moved. Something far older than the Delacroix family. Something that had been waiting long before they ever stepped foot in this house. The mansion wasn't just cursed. It was the curse. And the real truth was far worse than I could have ever imagined. The house had never been waiting for a sacrifice, it had been waiting for a host. For someone to become a mansion. And in that moment, I realized that the house had already claimed me. I'd been obsessed with the Ryujian Hotel for years. Its looming silhouette, haunting and incomplete, had become a symbol of mystery and fascination for many. Situated in Pyongyang, North Korea, the towering, unfinished structure had been abandoned for decades, its presence serving as a strange monument to both ambition and failure. The stories surrounding the hotel were as cryptic as the building itself, rumors of ghostly happenings, architectural flaws, and the eerie emptiness of its upper floors. So when I found out that the North Korean government was allowing a small group of tourists near the hotel, I couldn't resist. It felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to witness a piece of history that had captivated my imagination for so long. The day of the tour arrived, and I found myself at the gates of the hotel, standing in a group of other tourists who, like me, seemed equally intrigued by the enigma of the Ryujian. We were all kept at a distance, the hotel itself rising high above us like a sentinel that hadn't been touched in decades. It was difficult to look away from its jagged, unfinished spire. The building was meant to stand as a symbol of North Korea's ambition, but now it was a faded monument, its skeletal frame a reminder of an unrealized dream. Our guide, a stern-faced man in his early 40s, gave us a brief history of the hotel. He spoke with authority, but his words seemed rehearsed, lacking any passion for the subject. He explained that the Ryugyong was initially meant to be the tallest hotel in the world when construction began in 1987, but after years of delays and financial struggles, the project had been halted. The upper floors were never completed, and the glass windows were never installed. The eerie silence that hung in the air as we stood there was almost suffocating. There was no sound of traffic or the bustle of city life nearby. It was as if the hotel's mere presence swallowed up everything around it. I tried to take in the whole structure, but it was so massive, its hollow, unfinished design so alien that it was hard to truly comprehend it. The building's architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen. The Ryugyong Hotel was shaped like a massive, inverted pyramid with 3 wings extending from the central core. The triangular shape seemed to follow the energy of the surrounding air, creating a feeling of disquiet that I couldn't shake off. The hotel's facade was a patchwork of concrete and steel, a grotesque fusion of angular lines and exposed scaffolding that made the structure feel more like a colossal ruin than a building in progress. As I stood there, I could feel the weight of the place. It was as though it had been waiting for something, for someone to step forward and finally acknowledge its existence. I wasn't the only one who felt it. The other tourists exchanged nervous glances, some fidgeting, others barely able to mask their unease. A woman near the back of the group whispered to her friend, "They say the workers who built it never came back. Some say they disappeared. Others, that they just didn't survive." Her voice trembled, and her eyes darted around, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. I wanted to brush it off as superstition, but I couldn't help feeling a strange sense of foreboding. I had read the rumors, too. Stories of workers who had abandoned the project in fear, of construction accidents, of strange lights and sounds coming from the hotel at night, of people who swore they'd seen figures moving behind the unlit windows. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped sharply, and the eerie stillness of the area seemed to deepen. The guide motioned for us to move closer to the hotel, and we obediently followed, though I noticed that no one seemed eager to get too close. I, however, felt a strange pull toward the building, an inexplicable urge to move toward it despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The guide warned us to stay within the designated area, but my curiosity got the better of me. As we walked along the perimeter, I felt a pull in my chest, a magnetic force drawing me closer to the entrance, to the darkness that lay beyond the abandoned exterior. The hotel loomed larger with every step, its jagged edges cutting into the sky, towering over us like a watchful giant. We reached a small courtyard just outside the entrance, where the guide briefly explained that no one was allowed inside. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice that the windows on the lower floors were dark, completely devoid of any light. Yet, when I glanced up at the upper levels, I could have sworn I saw faint shapes moving behind the glass, shifting in and out of sight as if something was watching us. The sensation crawled up my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the dimming light. The air had grown thick with unease, and I could hear hushed voices among the group, their murmurs growing louder as more rumors were shared. "Some say the hotel is haunted," one man said, his voice low but filled with tension. "Others say it's a government experiment gone wrong." He paused, his gaze fixed on the structure. "I heard that the workers who were forced to leave, they didn't just leave. They were taken. I turned my head sharply, unsure of whether I had heard him correctly. "Taken?" I repeated. He looked at me, his expression inscrutable. People disappear around places like this. The energy here is wrong. You can feel it, can't you? Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the courtyard, sending a chill through my body. The guide quickly ushered us back, warning us to stay within the designated area and not venture too far. But even as I nodded in agreement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling at me, urging me to get closer, to go inside. As night settled fully over the hotel, I found myself staring at the dark windows once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The building seemed to grow more imposing, more alive in the darkness. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I could hear faint sounds, distant echoes that seemed to ripple through the empty hallways of the hotel. Soft, scraping noises, like footsteps dragging along the concrete floor, but too faint to pinpoint. The guide's warnings echoed in my mind. No one had been allowed inside for years. It was unsafe. But none of that mattered. The pull inside me only grew stronger. I glanced at the others in the group, but they were already beginning to retreat, their faces drawn with unease. The guide was leading them away, but I stayed behind, frozen in place as I felt the strange sensation intensify. I could not explain why, but I needed to go inside. Someone was calling me, and I couldn't resist. Before I knew it, I was walking toward the entrance, my feet moving on their own, as if the building itself had taken control of my body. The guide shouted from a distance, but I didn't hear him. I was already too close to the door. I didn't know what I expected when I reached the entrance, but it certainly wasn't what I felt. There was no dramatic change in the air, no doors swinging open in invitation, but something about the proximity to the hotel, the proximity to the unknown, made my heart race faster. The wind howled around me, but the air itself felt stagnant, as though the building were suffocating it, pulling it all into a void. The heavy, glassless windows loomed above me like the vacant eyes of a monster, and the dark, unfinished interior seemed to swallow every trace of light. There was no sound except for my own breath, which sounded strangely loud in my ears. My feet moved slowly but with determination, carrying me toward the heavy, rusted doors at the base of the hotel. I couldn't explain why I was doing this. I knew I shouldn't. I had seen the cautionary looks from the other tourists, heard the guide's faint shouts urging me to turn back, but I couldn't stop. It was like I had no control anymore, like some invisible force had taken the reins. My hand reached the cold metal of the door, and I pulled gently. To my surprise, it creaked open with ease, as if it had been waiting for someone to come along and disturb its silence. The sound of it swinging on its hinges was low and menacing, echoing through the empty courtyard. I stepped inside. The lobby was a dark, cavernous space, its walls clad in cracked concrete, the air heavy with a musty smell. It wasn't just dust or age, there was something darker about it, something that felt like decay. The floor, which should have been polished marble, was covered in grime and dirt, the remnants of forgotten years. Broken lights hung from the ceiling, some flickering weakly, others completely dark, and yet the space was so vast, it felt like the darkness was absorbing all the light. I stepped further into the lobby, my footsteps soft on the dirt-covered floor, and the strange weight of the air pressed against my chest. The architecture was surreal, too angular, too sharp. The hotel seemed to distort the very idea of a place meant for people to stay. The front desk was a mess of broken wood and torn metal, papers strewn across the counter, some of them yellowed with age. The entire place felt abandoned, yet something about it felt alive. I should have turned around. I should have listened to the warnings. But curiosity pulled me deeper. There were no signs of life, no sounds except the whispers of my own movements and the occasional creak of the building settling. But still, I felt watched. I felt as though eyes were on me, hidden in the dark corners, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I ventured farther into the lobby. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping even further, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, a contrast to the warmth of the day outside. As I walked deeper into the building, I heard something. A faint whispering, almost indistinguishable from the wind, yet too deliberate to be a draft. "Welcome," it seemed to say. "Come closer." I froze. For a moment, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe it was just the acoustics of the building. Maybe it was the wind passing through the broken windows, making odd sounds. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. There were several, overlapping, like an eerie chorus, speaking in a language I couldn't place. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked back toward the door. The darkness beyond was swallowing the dim light of the lobby, making it hard to see anything clearly. But my eyes caught something, a shape in the dark, standing near the door I had just come through. A figure, shrouded in the blackness. I could barely make out its form, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't a tourist. It wasn't one of the guides. It was something else. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, and continued deeper into the building. The hallway beyond the lobby was wide and lined with doors. Some were open, but I dared not approach them. My instincts told me not to. The walls seemed to close in around me, the strange whispers following, seeming to get louder and closer as I moved forward. Then, suddenly, everything went still. The voices stopped. The wind ceased. It was as if the building had held its breath. A soft thud echoed from the end of the corridor, followed by a faint dragging sound. It was unmistakable, footsteps. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I had to turn back. But I couldn't. Something held me here, like invisible hands pushing me deeper into the heart of the building. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward again, my feet reluctant but compelled. The dragging sound grew louder. It was coming from behind one of the doors further down the hallway. And then, just as I was about to pass one of the open doorways, I saw something move. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow that darted from one side of the room to the other, too fast for me to focus on. But as I turned to look, there was no mistaking it. A figure was standing in the doorway, staring out at me. The figure's face was obscured, hidden beneath a tattered hood, and its body was draped in a cloak that shimmered faintly in the dark, almost as though it was made of shadows. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but I felt its presence like a weight on my chest. I froze, caught in the figure's gaze. For a long moment, I couldn't look away, even though every instinct told me to run. It wasn't until the figure stepped back into the shadows of the room that I snapped out of my trance. I didn't wait to see if it was going to reappear. I turned and bolted, my footsteps echoing wildly through the hall as I ran back toward the lobby. But it wasn't until I reached the entrance, my hand grasping the rusted door handle, that I realized something. The door wouldn't open. I twisted the handle again and again, but it was locked. Somehow, it had locked itself. And worse, I could feel it, the building was no longer just an empty shell. It was alive. It was holding me in. I had stepped into something far darker than I ever imagined. I hadn't realized how long I had been running, how many turns I had taken, how deep I had wandered into the belly of the Ryujian Hotel until the panic set in. My chest tightened with each breath, my legs heavy as if the very air around me was thickening. The once strange building now felt like a trap, and no matter how much I twisted the door handle, the entrance remained steadfastly shut, as if the hotel itself were mocking my desperate attempts to escape. A sudden sound behind me stopped me cold. A door creaked open. I spun around, my breath shallow and rapid. The figure I had seen earlier was gone, but now the faint whispers returned, louder, as though beckoning me forward, urging me deeper into the hotel's heart. I hesitated for only a second before the strange pull, the invisible force I had felt earlier, took hold once again. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the hallway that had once felt so endless and suffocating, but now seemed like the only way forward. I couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of inevitability that hung in the air, as if the building itself had chosen me, and I had no choice but to follow. I walked cautiously, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. As I rounded the corner, I saw it, a narrow stairway that led down into the bowels of the hotel. The whispers grew louder, now indistinguishable from the voices of those who had come before me. I knew I had to go down there, despite the growing dread in my chest, despite the knowledge that I was walking straight into the very heart of the hotel's mystery. The stairs were steep and uneven, and with each step I took, the air grew colder, thicker. The faint smell of mold and decay mixed with something else, something far worse. As I descended, the shadows seemed to stretch, wrapping themselves around me like a living thing, pulling me deeper. The whispers were now replaced by soft murmurs, voices that sounded human, but just barely. And then, a low, guttural noise, a scraping sound, like something, or someone, dragging something heavy across the floor. When I reached the bottom, the darkness was absolute. There were no lights here, no broken bulbs or flickering shadows. The darkness swallowed everything, and I found myself straining my eyes in an attempt to make out anything in front of me. Then I saw it. A faint glimmer, a sliver of light coming from a crack in the wall. It was enough to lead me forward, and I stumbled toward it, my hands reaching out, desperately searching for answers. As I pressed my palm against the cold stone wall, the crack widened, revealing a hidden door, ancient and covered in dust. The door creaked open as if welcoming me, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw in the room beyond made everything else, the figures in the shadows, the whispers in the hallways, the strange pull of the hotel, make sense. The room was not just a storage space. It was a graveyard of memories, a collection of relics, personal belongings, and objects that seemed to breathe with the weight of the past. Old photographs, curling at the edges, were pinned to the walls, their subjects blurry, their faces half obscured in shadows. But what struck me the most were the faces I did recognize, the faces of workers, engineers, architects, and other unknown figures, their eyes wide with terror. Some of the photographs were taken in this very hotel, and I could see the unmistakable fear etched in their expressions as they stood before unfinished walls, as if they knew something dreadful was lurking behind them. At the center of the room was an old wooden table, covered with papers, books, and strange symbols drawn in black ink. The pages were filled with bizarre writings, diagrams of the hotel's construction, sketches of the building in its earliest phases, but all of them had one common theme: death. There were references to experiments, to rituals, to a strange force that had taken hold of the workers, something dark that had not only halted the construction but had driven many of them to madness. I reached out to touch the pages, my fingers trembling, and that's when I saw it. A small notebook, its cover frayed and worn, hidden beneath a pile of papers. I opened it carefully, my breath caught in my throat. the writing inside was different. The hand was shakier, more erratic, as though the author had been on the brink of insanity. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. It spoke of an entity, a presence that had been awakened when the hotel's foundation was first laid. An ancient force that had long been forgotten, buried beneath the soil. It had latched onto the workers, consuming them, driving them to madness. But it didn't just want the workers, it wanted the building, to be part of it, to bind itself to the structure, to the very land beneath it. The hotel was not just a place, it was a vessel, a prison, and a lure, trapping all those who came near it. And then I read my name. I stopped, blinking hard, convinced I was seeing things. But there it was, written in the same frantic handwriting, my name. My heart skipped a beat, my fingers gripping the edges of the notebook. It was impossible. How could my name be here, in this cursed place, tied to these events? The book described the force that had corrupted the construction, but it had no name. It only referred to itself as the vessel, a being that had come to life within the hotel, drawing people in, trapping them within its walls. I flipped through the pages in a frenzy, searching for answers, when I came across a final note. The vessel needs a new host. It is time. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, my mind racing. A sudden realization slammed into me like a wave. I had been chosen. Not by chance, but by something far older, far darker. I wasn't just some curious tourist. I was the next part of this terrible puzzle, the next link in the chain of this cursed hotel. I had been pulled here for a reason, drawn to this place as if my very existence had been foretold. The lights flickered once again, casting erratic shadows across the walls, and I heard it, the sound of scraping again, closer this time. I turned to face the room, heart pounding, but I knew I wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, silhouettes moving silently behind me. They were the workers, the souls who had disappeared, the ones whose lives had been claimed by the hotel. Their faces were twisted, deformed, their eyes wide with hollow terror. And as they stepped forward, their gazes fixed on me, I knew that I was their successor, the next to be consumed by the Ryujian Hotel. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The shadows grew longer, pressing in from every corner, until there was nothing left but darkness, and the feeling that I had always belonged here, within the walls of this cursed, unfinished tower. And then, the whispers started again, louder, more insistent. "Welcome home.